Welcome to the micro lecture. It's just a brief overview of consumer behavior. Putting in perspective, when we think about the customer, we're thinking about what in the 5 C's, excuse me, what are the 3 phases of the buying process? What kind of purchases are there? And how do consumers make purchases? And how can marketers use this information? This is a huge topic that requires way more discussion and learning than we're going to be able to do in here, but we just want to give you a little bit of a framework of what goes into consumer behavior and how consumers act. Consumer behavior came to be basically as psychology grew as a science. So much of what we see in consumer behavior theory and is really based on what we saw in psychological theory. It has been expanded greatly on as big data has enabled more precise study. We can really learn much, much more about consumer behavior by looking at their actual what they actually do, as opposed to theories that might support what they do. There are known reliable patterns of consumer behavior, including the phases consumers go through when they're making a purchase. Very generalized, but we can apply it to all different types of purchases. Looking at the different kinds of purchases consumers make, how consumers sense and learn and become motivated, form attitudes, and make decisions, all very important things as we think about the outcomes of some of our messaging that we do. And the cultural differences that influence consumers, that we're going to make a brief mention of it, but it's actually a pretty significant factor in current consumer behavior. So if we look at the purchase process, we talk about and by the way, one of the things I like about consumer behavior is we are all consumers. Even though we're studying it, we're also consumers. So we all can relate to what is being described about what consumer behavior is, because we've no doubt practiced it ourselves. So the purchase process requires a pre-purchase sort of step that takes place when we identify a need or a want, search for possible solutions, build a consideration set, meaning all the different things we might look at. We have to narrow that consideration set when we make a purchase and decide on a retail channel. So it's very deductive reasoning. We kind of think about, here's the broad sense of all the places we could look. We start to whittle it down, and then we decide on how and where we're going to buy it. And then post-purchase, we define our customer satisfaction, the likelihood to repeat, and generate word of mouth. We all do this, consciously or not, and it's all part of the purchasing process. Customers need to recognize a need or desire, which is, I think that's kind of goes without saying. Some are heavily marketer influences, some are not, so trendy clothes, things like that, we might be influenced by what marketers are communicating to us, versus the need to eat, which obviously is not as influenced by what marketers are presenting. Customers search and evaluate products that address their need. It's so easy to do these days. We can go online, we can ask friends, we can ask people online. We can get just no shortage of information out there on the different types of things things we should be putting in our consideration set. And all brands are considered as candidates for purchase when we build our consideration set, but then we have to narrow it down. So we might do that by delaying the purchase, or we may decide ultimately not to purchase at all. We all do that. We kind of go down the path of like, maybe I should get something like that, and then you think like, I really don't need it. Customers decide on the retail channel, which is important these days because there's more than one place to buy anything. So, and we know we have alternatives. In the post-purchase phase, customers determine their level of satisfaction. Did they get what you expect? Today, I'm just going to say this. This is one of the most amazing things I've seen in marketing in my career, is that the consumer has really flexed their muscle, and their voice is very clearly heard, by and large, due to online sources. So if you don't like what you see, there's all kinds of things you can do to say to other people. It's like, I don't like it. We used to call this word of mouth. we knew as marketers, we all knew it took place, but of course, there's no way to measure it, even know that it was happening. But friends talk to each other, family members talk to each other, all kinds of people talk to each other and say, I didn't like this, I did like that, or whatever the case may be. And today is actually archived in a digital format, and we see it. So I think about things like reviews and um, Yelp is a really powerful tool for that. So yeah, what people are saying about you matters a lot, as it probably should. So I'm going to put this to the test with the online world, who looks at, or in e-commerce, we look at something called a conversion funnel. So we think about all the different contexts. Now, I'll consider it all being done in a digital way, but we consider about all the different contexts and all the different kinds of messaging that happens, all kinds of different things that we do to get information out there. And then the consumer actually goes through a series of steps, and all the way through going to your website, putting that in a cart, and then checking out. All along the way, you can hunt on the purchase. You can just say like, all right, no, I don't really want it or whatever. And all that information is captured, and it's very important to an online marketer. So how's this happen? How's this ultimately affected consumer behavior? It's huge. Consumers are less loyal than they ever have been. Consumers are in control. I think that is just so incredibly important. They control the messaging. They control all kinds of things in the whole marketing process. So it's really had a profound impact on how we look at all these things. Consumers are researching products and services differently because it's so easy to do. Consumer to consumer recommendations are a key driver of preference. Consumers regularly told me as an e-commerce marketer that I pay much more close attention to the reviews that other consumers um, provide for a product than I do the copy and the information you provide me about the product. So it's amazing how powerful that's become. Consumers are now building their own solutions because they can customize in lots of cases and put together what they want to actually buy. Consumers are evaluating across unrelated products and services. I think that's really an important thing as well. And consumers have redefined the idea of negotiation. We all know that we have much more purchasing power than we used to have. So all these things have been really hugely impactful on consumer behavior, and something marketers have had to, and if they didn't, they did it at their own peril, but have had to pay very close attention to. There's different types of consumer purchases. There's convenience purchases. Think about a grocery store or something like that. You go there and you're buying things you normally buy. There's not a lot of involvement in it, maybe a little bit, but not a ton. We don't spend much time thinking about the product or the purchase. Now, think about it as when we go out and buy some clothes. No, I'm going to talk about it in a retail sense. I know we don't all buy clothes that way, but we might take a little more time. We might try things on. We might want to touch, feel, understand the product, that kind of thing. We might spend a little more time before we make the purchase. And there's specialty purchases which aren't made very frequently, but we think about the amount of time and effort that we put into it. So let's think about buying an appliance for our home, like a new dishwasher or something like that. We're going to be a little more involved in that purchase process than we would and what we buy at the grocery store. So those are the different types of purchases that there are. Okay. So in low involvement purchases, there's a higher level of price sensitivity. So we're kind of hyper aware of how much we pay for certain items. I think everybody knows what they pay for a dozen eggs these days. That's one factor goes into it. It usually goes well with price discounting strategies. Generally don't generate word of mouth. That's not entirely true, but not as much as others. Are usually distributed intensively, meaning that they're distributed in many, many different outlets. And marketers should focus on how to capture consumers' attention in those types of purchases. High involvement purchases have a lower price sensitivity and usually go well with events, maybe word of mouth, things like that. But they're usually distributed selectively, and marketers should focus on providing consumers with information in those types of purchases. These are very generalized concepts, I admit, but at least we have a sense of it. When we think about what actually, now this is where it kind of matches up with psychology a little bit. We think about sensory and perceptual impressions that become brand associations. We all can think of specific examples of brands that bring up some kind of sense of either quality or some kind of attribute of uh, of the brand in our minds. We can all think of brands like that. It's pretty powerful messaging when you think about it, and those associations are reinforced through a lot of the messaging that we do. Learning is the process that creates brand associations. I'm not going to go into all that stuff, but there's classical and operant conditioning that happen. Again, there's a lot of study here. If you want to learn more about it, my gosh, you could like, become a doctorate in this kind of a thing, you know. Um, you can't have a marketing class. I jokingly say this that without talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs shows that we have basic needs, psychological needs, and self-fulfillment needs that are kind of go up sort of a ladder. Think of it as the trip to nirvana, if you will, and uh, and each one of those things reflects a need that we have as human beings. Marketers may identify their products with different types of those groups. Okay, you know, sometimes it's pretty clearly identifiable that way. Sometimes not so much. Um, Marketers may think of using the hierarchy for positioning. So the example given here is Mercedes-Benz has their lower end C model, which is what they call quote unquote affordable. It's not affordable for most of us, but people talk about that. And you might move upward to the E model, the S model, and by the way, CL I wouldn't agree with, but I'm just going to say up to the S models of cars that they have because it's just moving up the food chain, if you will, of all the levels of car that they have. So, and they all fulfill a different need under Maslow's hierarchy. Okay. Attitudes and decision making influence how we think. This is where it all is, to be honest with you. And this is why marketers go through great pains to try to understand how people view your brand and your product. So whether consumers will buy a brand, repeatedly purchase it, become loyal, recommend it to others, all those kinds of things are all based on our personal attitudes and our desire to use those to affect the decision making of others. Okay, so with few choices, consumers usually compare brands to make a decision. But if you have many choices, you're probably going to go through developing this consideration set, thinking about all the brands you might consider, determine the brands in detail, and then start to whittle it down from there. Okay. So there's two different models here. I'm just going to go over these very quickly. There's a non-compensatory model. If a brand doesn't have important attributes, it's basically cut. So we've all experienced that where we said like, oh, well, if they don't have sustainable practices, I'm just not interested in them. So I cut them from my consideration set. Um, Compare brands in detail we look at the compensatory model, the cost benefits. We're going to talk about that a lot as we talk about the pricing and the positioning of the product. There's lots of ways to actually achieve that. And then the last thing I want to bring up is that there are definitely cultural differences, sociocultural differences. So depending on who your target market is, um, will affect every aspect of behavior that you can possibly imagine. So we think about all these different types of things in doing the marketing of our product. Okay. I know that's a real brief overview. We covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. There's a lot more to learn about it, but I think I gave you a basic understanding of what goes into consumer behavior. There's lots more to consider as well. So, but I just want to give you that brief overview of it. I think it helps you understand what some of the next steps that we're going to do. Considering the next steps, we're going to be looking at an organization's mission and strategy and think about how that affects our marketing plan. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I know this was a lot to cover in a very short period of time, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me, okay? All right. Best of luck, and we'll talk to you again.